Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Ownership Effect. I'm your host, Jim Bonham. In today's episode, we're continuing our conversation with Kendra Isaacson, a principal at Mindset, which is a bipartisan public policy firm here in Washington, D.C. In part one, we talked about why so many members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, are supportive of ESOP companies. And that conversation continues in today's episode, where we explore the current state of ESOP legislation and regulation and retirement policy in general. We also dive into why it's becoming so hard for younger generations to save for retirement and why working at an ESOP can help young families build long-term financial security. I have with me here today Kendra Isaacson, who was on our last episode, and we had such a great conversation about ESOPs and retirement and the legislative history that we've asked Kendra to be back again. So now, Kendra, you've done quite a bit of work in the Congress over in the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee on several bills. But there have been a couple passed in recent years called the Secure and then the Secure 2.0 Act. Tell us a little bit about what those two bills were about.
So Secure 1 and Secure 2.0 were a collection of bipartisan retirement bills, and they were aimed at fixing a lot of things in the system. In Secure 1, it introduced the concept of a pooled employer plan to help. Again, we mentioned that there's a coverage issue where 50% of workers don't have access to an employer-provided plan. So this would allow for economies of scale for small businesses to band together for a retirement plan. That was a big part of Secure 1. A lot of little technical retirement things. And then in Secure 2.0, it included the Work Act, which the ESOP Association was very much an integral part of, that would help boost employee ownership, the Employer Ownership Initiative at the Department of Labor, and make sure that across states they have the support that they need to support employee ownership. It also introduced automatic enrollment requirements and auto escalation requirements because people need that nudge. And I think that was a Nobel Prize-winning concept in economics to make sure that we have automation. So a lot of cats and dogs in retirement. But again, a really big, important component of this is that they're bipartisan. And retirement, everyone wants to retire. So that common goal keeps Congress working together, which is quite lovely in such a partisan environment right now.
Most good policy has a certain element of danger to it for policymakers, meaning, if you mess around with it, voters really pay attention to it. And I think retirement policy is one of those. We jokingly call it don't touch the third rail. And I think retirement policy is one of those areas where elected leaders are very, very cautious about making changes. Now, what's interesting about that is that anytime you want to make a change to ERISA, that does bring out a real specter of, well, we can't change ERISA for this thing, even though it might be really warranted, or we'll have to change it for all these other plans too. And have you ever encountered that as a staff member?
Well, usually when you're the ERISA staffer, people's eyes just glaze over when you start talking. No one really ever wants to talk ERISA because of its, complicated.
And here we are on our second episode talking about ERISA.
There are a lot of competing priorities right now. And I think it's a matter of, well, if you touch this, then this is also equally important. You need to do this as well. And whether there's enough support to be able to do competing priorities that really are unrelated. That is a challenge, I think, often on the Hill. And that's not just unique to retirement, though. It causes a lot of the action paralysis, I think, when you're on the Hill. If we can't fix this because I think ACA subsidies right now are a great example. Like, we can't extend the subsidies because we want to fix this whole system, but we don't have an answer yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So why is Congress becoming increasingly focused and interested in retirement security?
Well, I think it's a demographic issue. People are listening to their constituents. And right now, and if you think about it, retirees are quite a loud constituency. They have the time to make the phone calls, write letters. We certainly had a lot of active retirees when I was working on the Hill. And also they're just a huge cohort right now of constituencies. So, they are the biggest, generation right now, I think, or the biggest generation ever, and since they are retiring in record numbers, it's a really hugely important topic right now. There's so much focus on the economy, and affordability, and for retirees, the slightest, change makes a huge difference for their kitchen table economics. It's hard to do things that fix the situation immediately for this generation of retirees, but there are policies with respect to employee ownership. You can address some of today's issues right now. A lot of the retirement policy is sort of generations removed, but with employee ownership, you're dealing with succession in companies that are owned by baby boomers who are ready to leave the workforce.
I think you said in the last episode that there's something like 10,000 people retiring a day.
Yeah.
And that's just a mind-boggling number to get your head around. Overall, just from the overall economy, the number of people who are leaving the workforce, and the people who have to come in and fill those jobs. But for business owners, something like 3 million current businesses are owned by baby boomers who are set to retire within 10 years. And 65% of them have no succession plan, meaning they don't know what they're going to do with their business when they retire, even though it may be probably one of their largest assets. And they really only have, 3 or maybe 4 options. The worst option is they just close the business down. And we see that happen with small businesses around the country all the time. They don't have kids, or the kids don't want to take over and run the business. So they just close the doors. They sell off whatever minimal assets it may have, and the business doesn't exist anymore. They can sell the business to either a strategic buyer or maybe a competitor. There used to be, maybe there were 2 tire stores in your hometown, and one decides, well, we're going to retire, so we'll sell to the other one. Then they both operate with the same name, but you get some consolidation there, and some of the jobs will inevitably go away. Or they can, they try to leave it to a family member who then takes it over to a new generation. But sort of the fourth option is forming an ESOP, and it's one of those things that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. And it requires a lot of investigation by the business owner to really make sure this is something that makes sense for me, as well as the employees, and it's a good fit for our culture. But what's really terrific about ESOPs is how they keep the jobs local, and how it transfers a wealth-producing asset from an individual to being a wealth-producing asset for a large number of people. And that's one of the secondary public policy aspects that ESOPs are trying to solve. Is, we have a tremendous accumulation of wealth among a very small number of people in this country. And ESOPs, both as a retirement plan, but also as a matter of fiscal policy, or economic policy, distributes wealth-producing assets through a purchase to a larger number of people, which is something that doesn't happen a lot anymore. So you've been around Congress for a while, and we have a tendency in our country to really focus more on kind of the ideological battles than the policy battles. And you said something just a minute ago that I thought was really interesting about how retirement policy is really about future generations, not the current generation. So when Congress is discussing retirement policy now, who are they really discussing it for? Who are the beneficiaries of the plans that they're making now?
I think it depends on what specifically you're talking about. But for employee ownership, I think they're thinking about a current generation and, the millennials and Gen X, where they've been on the cusp for a little while of taking over, and waiting for baby boomers to retire, which I think some have said maybe they aren't retiring quick enough, or quickly enough. But so I think ESOPs and employee ownership presents a unique opportunity to deal with a very current pressing issue now. But retirement policy, when you're talking about things like auto enrollment and coverage, that is really something that you need the compound building over the career to in order to build the wealth, because that doesn't solve anything for a 59-year-old who's about to retire in a few years.
Right. So and what I'm getting at here is that one of the conversations that we hear a lot in our ESOP companies is with, the 20 something or even into their early 30s. They're like, don't talk to me about a retirement plan. I can't even pay. I've got student loans. I can't afford to buy a house. The thought of retirement right now is foreign to me. Just give me the money. Right. But it's important to really understand that, in order to have secure retirement, you need to start early. And this is, in many ways, this retirement policy opportunity is about younger generations. So what would you say to younger people who are really frustrated with their economic circumstances and the possibility that Congress and the White House could be taking steps to encourage more ESOP formation for the future?
This is something I feel like is my passion project about sort of developing financial literacy in younger people. It was important in my own journey of like becoming an ERISA attorney, because my dad didn't prepare for retirement at all, which is why I think I was very obsessed with doing it. And when I was on the Hill, it's about meeting people where they are. I think is really the most important part of this policy, because as we have been discussing in the past episode, it's this very arcane law where you've got a mix of tax code and you've got labor code, and it's very confusing, and people are like, ugh, and it is not that immediate satisfaction of like, here, I get my check right now and I can go spend it. But that eighth wonder of the world, compound growth, you start showing people like, if you can invest in this today, this is what you're going to have at retirement. And just really explaining employee ownership in a way that is meaningful to today's worker. Like it is sometimes hard when you're in the thick of like, having children, getting married, trying to buy a house, like to think that far ahead. But I think if you can explain employee ownership as a sort of means for achieving those goals and how it will help you in your current life, I think that is the way to do it.
What's interesting about, that family, that young family or the young worker who is like, listen, I can't afford my rent. Don't talk to me about a retirement plan. I think they are thinking about retirement plans in their more traditional sense, which is, okay, you're going to take a deduction out of my paycheck every month and you're going to put it into some plan that I can't touch until I'm like 65 or older. And sure, I understand there might be some tax benefits to that, but honestly, I don't have the extra income to put into that retirement plan. But ESOPs are very different from that because the employees don't actually put any of their payroll or any of their income into the plan. What they bring to the job is their contribution. And the longer they stay with the company and the more valuable they become to the company, the more shares get allocated to them over time. So it's one of those things that I don't think that younger workers really understand or may appreciate, that if we encourage more employee ownership, if we encourage more ESOPs, this is taking nothing away from your current paycheck.
I like that way of thinking about it.
So let's get back a little bit to this idea of the baby boomers retiring and the silver tsunami. What are the things that Congress can do to help encourage more formation of retirement plans? What are the shortcomings? What are the challenge spots?
Well, I think the adequate consideration regulation that we've been waiting for 40 years, is that
41 now.
41? I think that would go a long way in helping. We were teased at the end of the Biden administration where they proposed a regulation. I guess it was the Thursday or Friday before President Trump was inaugurated, and then it was quickly pulled back.
We were kind of happy about that because the proposal that they put forward was really was kind of unworkable from our perspective.
I don't even think it was printed in the Federal Register by the time it had been pulled
Right.
back.
So it wasn't actually an official proposed regulation.
Right. And so I think DOL acting on that and finally, meeting the duty that they have been reminded of, in Secure 2.0, that they should issue that regulation would be great. But in the meantime, since
Now, before we go, why is that important? What is adequate consideration, and why is it so important for ESOP formation?
it's so important because that's the that's the whole crux of the transaction is that you have to pay an adequate consideration or the employees must pay adequate consideration to the owner as the sale. And this is something very unusual in ERISA because these are parties in interest. And so they are, that's a very technical term, but
Let me see if I can do it in sort of
okay.
layman's terms.
Okay.
So that one of the biggest policy challenges for the formation of an ESOP is generally the person selling the business is the person who is arranging the transaction. So how do you create an arm's length transaction so that the seller isn't sitting on both sides of the table negotiating with themselves? Well, the way you do it is you have to have a trustee who represents the ESOP plan, and that trustee needs to be independent from the seller, and they have to negotiate with one another so that you reach a fair market value where a willing buyer, in this case the trustee, and a willing seller, without other undue forces, reach an agreed upon sales price. The Department of Labor's had 41 years to describe what this process should look like.
I mean, bureaucracy is known to be slow, but this is
It's getting ridiculous. Now, the current administration seems they put out in their March regulatory notice that this is on the top of their list, and that they appreciate that it doesn't have to be an overly complicated regulation. And in many ways, it's actually a simplification of all of the case law and sort of the external advice that has been out there that's created a real guesswork for a lot of ESOP fiduciaries in doing their jobs of making sure they don't either overpay or underpay. Because that's the other part of adequate consideration is that when you leave an ESOP company, you want to make sure that you're getting paid fair market value. So we have argued as the ESOP Association that we're sort of ambivalent we are ambivalent about the price. We just want a fair, reasonable, knowable process that a fiduciary can follow and have a reasonable confidence that they are not going to be second guessed
through litigation, and it's just someone coming through just saying like, this doesn't feel right.
We think you could have paid less. Well, it's it's like getting an appraisal on a house. You can get 3 different appraisals and they're going to come back with 3 different prices.
Well, and then the fiduciary obligation is really about the process too. It is not supposed to be, hindsight is 2020 and someone, several years later saying, "Oh, you could have done better," or "That was a terrible deal," with all of the information at that time. But it's about the process and the information you have at the time you're making your decision. So those regulations would be incredibly helpful in guiding that process.
Congress, namely 2 senators, Senator Marshall and Senator Kane, Republican and a Democrat, came together and they introduced legislation in the Senate that would allow a fiduciary, an ESOP trustee, to hire an independent valuation firm or appraiser that follows the IRS rules, which is IRS guidance 59-60. Or revenue ruling 59-60 that describes, right, these are generally the appropriate ways to value a company. That if a fiduciary hires an independent appraiser and they follow 59-60, that they have fulfilled their good faith effort in valuing the stock. And that should help streamline and certainly reduce some of the complexity around forming an ESOP and running an ESOP. So that would be a good thing that Congress could do.
It would be a great thing that Congress can do. And, this is one of those unique situations where it passed unanimously out of the Senate Help Committee earlier this year. It passed unanimously out of the House Education and Workforce Committee. And they don't usually do things on a bipartisan basis. And it passed out of there. So, and it has passed the Senate. So we are just waiting for House passage, and that will become law. And, it's pretty I'm going to knock on wood. I don't want it to mess up the microphone, but we're very hopeful that will pass. And again, this has brought together the most liberal members of Congress with the most conservative, and it really demonstrates that when there is a good common goal, and ESOPs are one of those that we can come together and work together, even in a really polarized environment where not much else is getting done.
Well, I appreciate that. We may need to have you come back again to talk about some of the tax policies, because you are a bit of a tax expert. Maybe we can have another guest on as well, and we can talk about maybe some of the tax changes that could be made to further encourage employee ownership and ESOP specifically, as well as some of the dangerous ways that ESOP popularity could be leverage for people who want to do things that aren't necessarily employee ownership. So, Kendra, I want to thank you again for coming on for a second time. It's always been fascinating. It's always great to talk to you about employee ownership and retirement policy. And I hope the viewers enjoyed it as well.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. As always, please remember to subscribe, like, and rate us on your favorite podcast player and our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time on The Ownership Effect.